All right, folks, on to Niccolo Machiavelli. Maybe the first modern political thinker. He certainly had some modern elements that we can discuss, but he also has some important connections back to ancient political thought and the kinds of things that we read with Plato. So those are some interesting sort of comparisons that we'll want to make. But he's also quite important simply because in the political world and in political science, we often talk about Machiavelli. He's got his own adjective that's a very central one in political discourse, Machiavellian. Um, Now, this is connected mostly to the book The Prince that maybe a lot of you guys have read in the past. It's a book that, frankly, I did not examine until I was in this job. Not that I wasn't aware of it, not that I didn't have a copy, but I never read it formally in college. I never read it formally in grad school. And the times that I had picked it up and thumbed through it, I was sort of like, what's the deal? Why is this so famous? This just doesn't seem very good. Doesn't seem as creative and interesting as Plato. Doesn't seem as profound and well developed as the moderns that come after him. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau coming up next. So I never really got what was up with Machiavelli. And yet, as I have started teaching it in this class, I have become fascinated by Machiavelli. And what's so fascinating about Machiavelli? Well, it can be summed up in this sense. He wrote The Prince that we know him most for, and he wrote another larger work called the Discourses on Livy. We're reading from both of them, and they have a very different feel. There are a lot of commonalities in them. But there are some statements and some commitments in his political thought in those two works that seem very different, that seem almost incompatible. And so, in terms of interpretation, Machiavelli raises this very interesting question of who is the real Machiavelli? Is he the Machiavelli of the Prince, the Machiavelli of the Discourses, the Machiavelli of the two of them together? How do we figure all that out? And so that's sort of the fun of studying Machiavelli, and the different conceptions of him are so different. They have such different value judgments attached to them. So that's sort of fun. So Machiavelli, 15th, 16th century, Renaissance era Italian. He was a bureaucrat in Florence. Florence was a republic. It gets overthrown. It gets taken over by one of its prominent families, the Medici family. And as sort of a prominent bureaucrat, Machiavelli loses his job, goes into sort of internal exile. He's not like kicked out of the country, but he's not welcome in the court of the Medicis. And this is the dates on this get a little funky, but he's writing this work, The Discourses, and he puts it down and says, all right, I got to do something. He writes in a matter of months The Prince, which is what he is most known for, and dedicates it. He was writing it for and was going to dedicate it to Giuliano de' Medici, who, by all accounts, was kind of a bastard, kind of, a jerk. And a lot of people speculate that The Prince in its flavor is written sort of as a love letter to this prince, to this new ruler. Here's some advice to you. Hey, can I come back to court? Giuliano dies. Lorenzo de' Medici is in charge. Doesn't seem particularly interested in Machiavelli's Prince. And eventually Machiavelli works his way back into good favor. But that's the context of the Prince. And do we really care about that context? How important is that context to our understanding of the work? Was it just like his job application? Like, hey, please, here's me telling you what you want to hear. Also, I spent years and years working on this other work that was not for public consumption. These are my real views. That's how a lot of people like to read Machiavelli, as in the discourses were his views. And yet, when we think about interpretation, why is Machiavelli important? Well, he's important for the views that are expressed in The Prince. So what do we do with that? How do we look at those two things? Right. So particularly here, he is infamous because religious scholars in the church itself picked up on the fact that not only do a lot of the discussions in The Prince seem to be immoral or amoral, as in morality is not really interesting, power is what's interesting, but there's also a definite flavor about states and governments being independent of the church, not being dependent on the church, not trusting the church, looking after the interests of the municipality, of the state, of the people, without being under the church's thumbs. Well, that's quite interesting to a lot of religious officials and to a lot of rulers, kings, who claim their position by divine right, by saying, God and the church say I should be the ruler, that I am divinely appointed, and I have this direct connection to God, and that's why the people should follow me. And Machiavelli is, this is again part of what makes him sort of modern. He's throwing a wrench into that. No, the state and the populace, they're the central units that we should be concerned with. So I have this little chart here that I've set up, and it's kind of dense. There's a lot of information. I don't know that I'll go through all of it, but I think that you can read Machiavelli and come out with, let's see how many I've got here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different Machiavellis that I see in these texts, and that you could pick these texts apart and make a reasonable case for any one of these. Now, the classic one, as I sometimes call this, the bastard or the villain or the lover of tyrants. It's the Machiavelli who says the ends justify the means. It's the line that we're most familiar with, having to do with Machiavelli, and yet he never actually says it. By the way, we can talk later about what he actually says, getting into the text. But he says something akin to, actually, do I have it right here? Ends and means. I do have it right. This is the importance of note taking. I promise I did not plan this. He says, in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, where there is no impartial arbiter, one must consider the final result. That's what he says. The ends justify the means. Is that some call for kings and princes to be tyrannical? Not so sure it is, right? But that is our understanding of it. So we know the ends justify the means. And I have here, right, the ends of the ruler, right? So the prince is justified, perhaps, in doing anything in order to maintain his or her own power. Power is everything. There's no morality. There's no external good or bad. An action is only good or bad because it enhances and sustains or undermines the prince's power, right? And again, power is key, and the thing you want to avoid at all costs is dependence, which, by the way, for those of you who are political scientists and I are, that does feel a little bit like realism, right? A lot of these descriptions I have in here do actually blend over different categories, but I just want to sort of, put them in one or another box. And so avoid dependence, maintain your power, develop your power. Everything is always about power, power, power. Presumably because that's good for the ruler, is this interpretation of Machiavelli. He definitely has a focus on war and on conflict. He thinks that that politics, both within the state and between states, is all about war and conflict. That's inevitable. That is based on the way people are, on human nature, this negative view of human nature. And so, the prince who wants to defend their own position and their own privilege is always preparing for war, striking first, killing your enemies, killing, domestic and international, and that, cruelty is the only thing or the thing you can best count on, not kindness, not alliances, not trust. Also, again, as mentioned, you can't rely on the church either. You have to build up your state and rely on yourself. And this is all the stuff that we might call Machiavellian, right? It comes out of the prince, and it's a rather harsh, mean-spirited, selfish reading of the prince. We also have, somewhat similarly, the realist reading, or I call it the utilitarian, because utilitarian is not a moral principle, it's a moral principle. And it's the idea that the ends justify the means, in the sense that the good of the people justifies anything that the ruler does for that good, which might mean torturing and killing some individuals, or it might mean waging a preemptive war, or it might mean keeping your word when it's convenient and going against your word when you need to and it's necessary. The idea that there are no abstract principles and that the prince has to be flexible in order to maintain power in order to produce peace and security in a world that Machiavelli is looking at, where peace and security and not being dominated or invaded by your neighbor is no guarantee. Maybe the advice to cultivate and maintain and guard and build your power as a ruler, both domestically and internationally, is, it's for the good of the people. It's something that you want to do that's nice, right? And again, this idea that politics is about conflict, and understanding that conflict and acting appropriately within it is what you want to do. Again, here, like with the villain, human nature is sort of selfish and untrustworthy, which means that, again, you have to use power. Sometimes you have to use punishment. Sometimes you have to use not cruelty for the sake of cruelty, but appropriate punishments. You want to be nice when you can, but when being nice risks the stability of the state, you crack down hard. You kill your enemies. You torture the dissidents. Not because you like doing that, but because that's what it takes to serve the people. Is this realist utilitarian sort of view. You can't count on anyone, and the people are counting on you as the ruler. There's also this idea here that skill, that there's a lot of luck. Even though there's a science, as we say, of politics, there's a lot of luck involved. And so, from a realist view, if you can't tell what's going to happen, the course of history, how it's going to go, you have to cultivate your skill and your power, your virtue, in order to be able to roll with fortuna. To make the most of your opportunities when they present themselves, and insulate yourself against disastrous calamities that might befall you, invasions or rebellions or things like that. And so this is, again, a prince-focused outlook, but it's a more generous view on the prince. It's saying that, all of this stuff here is not necessarily wrong, but the mistake here is saying that Machiavelli was giving advice to the prince because, hey, prince, I don't give a crap about the people. All I care about is you. You do you. Whatever you do to the people for your own power, privilege, wealth, advantage, you just go do that. Here's some advice on how you can do it, right? And it involves killing people and being cruel and things like that. But if we flip that around and say, well, Machiavelli is just looking at a very war-torn, conflictual, unstable world full of people who are kind of not trustworthy and nasty to each other. And he's saying, in a world like that, what's best for the people is a prince who is powerful and who takes firmly control of the state and who guards the state against external threats by making it internally as strong as possible. All right. Then we got the Republican Machiavelli. This is the Machiavelli of the Discourses. It says that the prince is this BS thing that he wrote in order to pay the bills, in order to get a job, to get back into favor. But his real views, the real Machiavelli, is the Machiavelli of the Discourses, which he spent years writing, and which is, by all accounts, a much better work. It's longer. It's much more interested in history. It's more complex. It's just, right? It's a better work. And so this is the true Machiavelli. And Rousseau, in fact, put forward this idea that the Discourses is so superior and it's so clearly the true Machiavelli. The way The Prince is written is actually as a satire. It's as a satire of tyrants. And so, the way you should read it is the things that are said in The Prince are so ridiculous that they're pointing us towards the Discourses, where he says, Republican self-rule, rule by the people, is superior. I tend to think this is a rather weak reading of The Prince, that it was satire. A lot of people think it's authoritative because Rousseau said it. I think it was just sort of self-serving. Rousseau is a Republican, and he wants to take Machiavelli and make him part of the team. But I will say that this idea, very clearly stated in, as you guys read, in the Discourses, that self-rule by the people is the best and most stable form of government when it works. That it's way better than rule by a good prince. That's interesting, right? That is interesting. There's also this element in here that I think is quite fascinating, and it's this idea that what makes a republic work? Why is it so good? It's because its institutions harness the conflict, which is inherent in politics, and the friction between different interest groups, and use that to the benefit of the state, to use that energy to make the state stable. So if you think about modern America, or not modern America, but America's constitutional system, and the idea of federalism and separation of powers and institutions where different players in society have a seat and can check each other and can force each other to work together for the good of the whole. It's very Machiavellian in the Discourses sense, but certainly not in the Prince sense. So I think that's all quite interesting. And Rome, 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 Rome. It's a big love letter to Rome, because I think Rome did this. Right? They set up the different the plebeians and the Senate, and the emperor, and all the different factions of society had representation, and it was well balanced, and it lasted for for hundreds of years in a rather pristine self-governing form. That's the ideal. That's what Machiavelli would like for his people. Is this Republican reading? And also in this is this focus, one of the reasons Rousseau likes him so much, on civic virtue, that the state needs to cultivate virtue, patriotism, loyalty, courage, love of state, love of the community in the people. That stuff that, these are very ancient values, right? And that is the key also to making a republic or a state in general work, because human nature is kind of, in the abstract, kind of nasty. We're all stabbing each other in the back. We're all selfish. But if we can tone that down a little bit with a state that encourages our virtue and our loyalty and our love, our patriotism, then maybe we can have a state where we all, as citizens, look out for the community. This is one of the reasons, for instance, that he hates mercenaries so much. They just fight for money, and there's always someone else who has more money. But your community is yours, and if you grow up and you live in a state, a community where you love the people, you love the community, and that's everything to you, there is no other community that can replace that. Is part of one of the reasons why a republic might be so stable. These last two I'm going to go through very quickly, or these next two. The Italian patriot, right? This idea that he's in it for Italy. He sees Italy threatened by the church's alliances with other Christian nations, with other kings and French and German forces and things like that. And he's like, no, what I want is my people to not be conquered, to be safe, to be secure. Italy first. Make Italy great again, right? This is Rome, 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 Rome. Maybe the reason he's obsessed with Rome is because he loves the idea of an Italian people ruling the world, being safe, being protected, being in control of their own destiny, not being at risk from other peoples. And so maybe there's a very peculiar idea here that Machiavelli saw this idea in this very conflictual time for a strong prince to arise, and not simply to run Florence or whatever, but to unify the Italian peninsula and reassert Italy as a powerful player. And that might, right, it might just be all about Italy. And in this context, in this time, in this situation, maybe he thought, day one, it's a republic is good for my people or for Italy. Day two, it's a prince. Whatever's good in the moment for Italy, maybe is what Machiavelli is into. Also, it might just be the political scientist here, and this is I think interesting, right? The idea that he was an empiricist. He looked at history, he looked at the behavior of people, he looked for patterns in human nature, patterns in history and society and government, and he said, this is how it works. When A, then B. When X, then Y. That's what all the statements are. And so you read the prince as when you have a prince, and it's a new prince or an old prince, and the tradition prince, or a prince from outside of the territory. Well, then if you behave this way, this other thing will happen. And it's advice in the sense of it's a causal prediction of, in circumstance A, if you behave this way, this will happen. If you behave this other way, this other thing will happen. And that might just be what he's doing. And in a republic, when you behave this way, this will happen. And when you design your institution this other way, this other thing will happen. Right? So that might just be what he's doing. And I like to say this, there's so much history. There's this obsession with facts and history and observation of human nature. Maybe that's why he's so into Rome. And maybe he's just Aristotle 2.0. He's observing the world and he's telling you how it works. And then finally, here is my last sort of, this is what I think. And what I think is not what a lot of people have historically think. It's not what people think currently, overwhelmingly. This is what I think after, teaching this class, reading Machiavelli, reading Plato, reading the people who came before and after him. I think what he is doing, maybe like the medieval folks, he's struggling with certain aspects of Plato and the cave. And I don't mean that literally, but he's struggling with those questions of, if you are a believer in, say, a certain ideal government like republicanism, and you believe that republican self-rule requires good people not distorted by living in a bad, degenerate state, how can those bad people develop a good state? How can they acclimate themselves to a good state, build it, put it in play, if they have degenerate natures that are selfish and lacking of virtue? How does that happen, right? How do you get out of the cave? And in the medieval theorists, we had, God and Jesus and Scripture get us out of the cave. Maybe Socrates gets us out of the cave. For Machiavelli, my view is that the prince gets us out of the cave, that we have a degenerate people living under a bad government. And the prince comes in, and through flattery and through cruelty and through whatever ends he needs, whatever means he needs to take over and secure his rule and put in place the institutions that will build a republican people and force, again, either through sticks or carrots or tricks or ideology, right, through use of religion, myths of the metals, whatever. The prince takes over, builds a state under just laws, and new generations of people grow up under those just laws and acclimate to a more just way of being, and then you get a republic. You have a people capable of liberty, fit for liberty, grown under the institutions of a wise prince who sets it in place, and then those people can self-govern as a republic for many, many generations. The friction that's built into the system, the institutions, manages conflict. It harnesses the natural conflict of politics in order to sustain the republic and stave off the inevitable generation. Because much like Plato in Book 8 of the Republic, Machiavelli thought that the world, that history, that politics was cyclical, and that even the best state would degenerate. And so I have this view, and it may not be the view, but I have this view of Machiavelli after reading these two works, after thinking about it, after placing it in this canon of political thought, that what he is trying to do is figure out where's his shot for revolution, where's his shot to get to the best way of being, the most stable, the most secure, the republic where the citizen soldiers defend the republic with their lives and ensure the security of the people. And you don't have the same threats of everybody stabbing each other in the back and the state crumbling either internally or externally. How do we get to that? Well, it looks like it's going to have to be the strong hand of the prince the strong, wise hand of the prince who gets us there. And maybe that's a clearer answer than Plato's answer to the cave, or at least that's how I read it. And maybe you read it entirely differently. But that's one of the fun things for me, and one of the reasons why I haven't cut Machiavelli out of this course. Not just his historical importance and what he stands for in terms of ideas of realism, or as a proto-republican that's important to people like Rousseau, or as an early political scientist who's a forerunner of our modern discipline. I think that it's just a fascinating sort of challenge to interpret these various sections. And if he's saying what I think he's saying, I think it's a very sort of subtle and interesting and complex answer to the great questions that were raised by Plato. All right, folks, that's Machiavelli. Hope you enjoyed.